All right, Larry. I'd just like to say thank you for participating with us today. We're here as part of the Kansas Humanities Grant to record oral histories related to the Vietnam War. For the start, would you state your full name and then your branch of service and what your highest rank achieved was, just for the record?
My name is Larry Stanfield, and I was in the Navy during the Vietnam conflict and branch of naval aviation, actually. And highest rank was the E4.
And how long were you in?
I was in 4 years.
4 years.
Mm-hmm.
If you would just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and how you got to the service.
Well, pretty much I'm in. I was raised in Arizona, in Phoenix, and moved to Kansas City in the early '60s. Went to high school here, and after high school, we did a little college and everything, and met my wife, and we were married. And shortly after that, there was still the draft going on during Vietnam, and I was one of the few to get selected to go and to enlist. So I decided to listen to the Navy. I always had a background in aviation. I actually had my pilot's license before I had my driver's license. And so I always had a great interest, and I wanted to, if I was going to go in, I wanted to be in aviation, some sort of whatever it was, just to be in that field. My dream was to go in as a warrant officer and fly helicopters or whatever, but that didn't work out. So I enlisted in the Navy. They guaranteed me an aviation position and went to school for that after boot camp.
So what was your position in aviation?
I was an air anti-submarine warfare technician. Went to electronics school. I guess my test score, I knew nothing about electronics when I went in, but I learned. They did send me to school for that, and became a electronics technician, and especially with anti-submarine warfare. And that was my position there. Mm-hmm.
So, I'm prior service, but I don't know a whole lot about that particular subset of the Navy. Can you explain a little bit to me about what your job was or what you did? Or?
Well, we flew S-2 aircraft, which was a prop plane, and monitored submarine traffic. And our mission was to find and destroy enemy submarines. Was the basic interest in that. During Vietnam, we had a different aspect of that and a different mission, but that's what we were mainly training for.
What was the mission in Vietnam?
Same thing, basically, but we also monitored a lot of the ship traffic. To Vietnam, we monitored what was going in, coming out of Vietnam, as well as ship traffic. If something was suspicious, and we would either go after it and find out what was going on, or notify some other agency or group to go for the problem.
So you guys collected a lot of intel? Did you work with intelligence agencies?
We had a large intelligence operation on there. I couldn't tell you much about it. I wasn't really involved in that. We did a lot of operations. For anti-submarine warfare, we have to monitor under the water, so we drop a lot of buoys around, listening sound devices to monitor submarine traffic.
So you were. First, I want to ask, what high school did you go to?
I went to Shawnee Mission West, and then I went to Wentworth Military Academy.
Okay. And then, so you were married prior to enlisting?
I was already married, yes, and had a son.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
How old was your son when you enlisted?
1. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what that was like. I mean, you know,
It was. I was already working. I had a good job with Postal Service as a letter carrier back then, and um, uh, you know, everything was going fine. Great. And then I decided, was with some buddies one time, and we just, they decided they were going to, enlist, and I went with them and found out some information and stuff. And with my interest in aviation, I thought, well, maybe this is a way to get, ahead and further my career in aviation. And so I went down, talked to a couple of recruiters, and actually went a couple of times. We talked about it at home, and so I went down and enlisted. And they guaranteed me the aviation aspect of it. And after that, well, I think maybe 6 months after that's when I went active duty.
If you don't mind me asking, what was that conversation like with your wife when you came home with the idea?
Well, honestly, I don't remember it really well, but it was like, what are you thinking? What are you doing? But she was really supportive. I mean, it wasn't yes or no, go in, don't go in, I'm for it, I'm not for it. It's, she was really supportive. And if it wasn't for her being really supportive about it, I probably, may have changed my mind, may not have changed my mind, I don't know. But she knew it was ahead. She knew I had to go away for boot camp, and then we didn't know what was going to happen after that, where I'd, be stationed or, moving. The hardest part, I think, because her family was all from Kansas City, and they still do live here, and so she's really close to her family. So the hardest part was to move away, and but after we got out and out of boot camp, and found out where I was going to be stationed, and everything worked out really well, though.
So you sign up, and then I'm assuming while you went off to training, she stayed here close to family.
Yeah, she stayed home. Mm-hmm. Actually, she lived with my family.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like? That initial, family separation. That.
Well, for me, it wasn't. It wasn't a big hardship for me, because I knew she was being taken care of, and my son was being taken care of. So that part of it, I felt fine, just making sure everything was in order. But during boot camp, you don't have a whole lot of time to think. So it's about outside or anything else. So she stayed active, with her friends and family and everything. So everything, everybody was taking care of everybody.
What year was that you went to boot camp?
1969.
And what was that boot camp experience like?
It was different. I was in San Diego. I was in military school for a couple of years, so I kind of, had a little bit of military discipline, I guess. And so the boot camp was not a shock to me. I already knew how to march and do a lot of different things, and just the getting up with the trash cans being thrown down the middle of the barracks was, that was a good alarm clock to wake, get you going, get you hustling. But after a while, you learn a lot. There's a lot of things to learn that you didn't think you had interest in, but there's a lot of survival skills you learn, and how to live on your own, and be independent, I guess.
What was the most challenging portion of your service, would you say?
Probably the long deployment that we had. It was about 8 months. We were out in the Pacific, Westpac, and most of the time it was at sea, but we did go to different ports over in Japan and Hong Kong, Singapore, a few places like that. but not knowing, because our schedule was changing all the time, where, you know, we're going to a war zone, or, you know, we got deployed to do something else. You know, just kind of the unknown was the most challenging part of it, not knowing, you know, for sure when we're coming back, but, you know, maybe we'll get, you know, diverted or changed to go some other mission or something like that. But that was about the most challenging.
Were you on an aircraft carrier?
I was on the USS Ticonderoga.
And what is that?
It's an aircraft carrier. It's an old World War II aircraft carrier. They converted to an angled deck carrier to become it was an attack carrier early in the Vietnam War, and then they changed it toward the end of the Vietnam War to be more of a supportive aircraft carrier.
What's it like being at sea?
Busy and relaxing. You know, times when operations weren't going on, I worked the flight deck, and when times weren't going on, you know, any flight ops or anything like that, you did have some free time, and, you know, sit around, just, you know, you could read, you know, they had movies and things like that too, but we had a shop that we did some work in, and then, you know, when you did have your free time, you just sat back and, you know, on the balcony and relaxed. You know, it was nice, but you were very cramped. It was, you know, since it was an older aircraft carrier, wasn't we didn't have the sleeping accommodations like they have now and stuff. We 3-man bunks, and which was a canvas mattress, and, you know, you're 3 to 4 people high, and, you know, stacked in there. But it was interesting. It was sometimes fun, sometimes exciting, sometimes scary. You know.
Do you still remember the names of the guys that were on your bunk?
No, not really. I think after we got out and the everybody kind of went their own ways, but there's a few people I know. I know my commander Herzer, and my wife was actually, while I was deployed at sea, she was the Enlisted Men Wives Club president of it, and the commanding officer's wife was also in there, you know, to let them know what's going on and things like that. So, but no, I don't remember any. It was kind of you're on 12 hours on, 12 hours off. So when I'm in there, I'm sleeping, and so is everybody else. And then when you leave, another group comes in and they sleep. So, you know, you just it's the way it was.
Where were you stationed?
San Diego, North Island.
So when you were gone in this 8 month long deployment, she was in San Diego.
Right. Yeah.
What was that like for her, and how did you guys communicate?
Well, like I said, she was, you know, they had an enlisted wives club, and they did different things together and stuff. And you know, back at home, we had some. We lived in an apartment complex at first, and there was a lot of Navy personnel that lived there too, and families. And so they got along. They had groups. They got, you know, support groups and things like that. And you know, they try to you know, find out what's going on. But it kept them busy. Kind of kept their minds off the, you know, the fact that we weren't there, and, you know. And it helped us too, because we knew that they were something, you know, they just weren't sitting around. They had something to do, and keep them active, I guess.
Well, were you guys able to communicate?
By letter. That was it. We didn't have emails or anything like that then. That, you know, there was no chance. I think we stopped at one time in Hawaii. I do remember they did have a phone bank there, and we could call home from there, but that was about the only time we actually talked to each other, and that was maybe a 2-minute phone call, but other than that, it was just letters back and forth.
What was the turnaround time on those letters?
Oh, it depends. Since you're at sea, you know, whenever they could get a mail drop in, I would say somewhere around a week to 2 weeks, maybe.
What how did your service impact your identity? I mean, who you were before you went in and who you were after you got out.
Well, you learn responsibility. You learn how to, like I said earlier, you learn how to, be independent, and, cope, with different situations and things like that. You learn respect. There's a lot of that that helps you in getting along in life that you take with you. And, I appreciate that, I really do, because I think that's the most important thing is, respect authority, respect whatever.
How did your service impact your family life, and not just your wife, but also your broader family?
My family, I was pretty much raised by my mother only, and it didn't really affect a lot going on with that. Her family life, she did, miss them and, wanted to get back, and, the Kansas City, which we eventually did, but, that part of the family life. Her sister also came to visit a few times, and her aunts, and some of the family came down to visit us too. So because they wanted to see San Diego and go to the beach, I think. But it was not really an adversely eventful, happening.
And I'm just curious about the operations when you're on the aircraft carrier, because my own personal interest. Would you guys, you would operate mainly from the aircraft carrier, the aircraft, and they would take off and do their missions and then come back and land on the aircraft carrier?
Yeah, I was, since I was an electronics technician, I worked there. I worked flight deck from 6 at night to 6 in the morning. All weather conditions, no matter what it was. And so some electronic radio usually, or something wasn't working right before takeoff, they'd call me to troubleshoot it. And I think that's probably was the scariest part of my whole career, because you've got 50 planes, props, turning, helicopters, a few jets, engines, that kind of change the wind factor on you. You don't know. Plus, you're working at night, no lights. I mean, that's completely dark a lot of times, and trying to, with everybody's moving around. Planes are moving, getting ready for takeoff. They're kind of like shuffling. It's kind of like being on I tell people it's like, picture yourself on a football field, and now make it move forward and back and sideways to sideways because of the ocean. And then you've got planes moving all around on that football field, trying to get in a position to take off. And then you're going from plane to plane, if they call you to fix a radio problem or what, and sometimes you can't fix it. I think the actual scariest part of my job is they had what's called a transponder, and it's in the back of the airplane. The only way to access that is through, we call it the hell hole. It's in the tail, and you go from the bottom of the plane back into the the airframe section, and to get to it. Well, their transponder needed to be changed. While I was in there, somebody went to get a new transponder. I was up there unwiring it, the old one that didn't work, and they were moving the planes. Well, I really wasn't sure where I was at, because I was working, and the guy gives me a new transponder. I change it out, and then all of a sudden the tail drops. Well, I couldn't get out, and what I realized is I was on the catapult, and they hooked up the tail and gave it pressure, and I could hear the engines rev up. I'm going, we're going to take off. And I'm back here in the back, and it's not going to be a fun experience for me because it's all airframe, and there's not a lot of padding, so I'm back there bracing, and I'm talking on my mic. I couldn't hear anybody because earphones weren't working in my headset. And so I was back there. It seemed like a long time, bracing, and then pretty soon the tail comes up, and I dive out of there pretty quick. And so we downed the plane and had to come back on and out. But yeah, I thought I was going flying, with no shoulder straps or anything to hold me back, because they take off pretty quick. It shoots them out pretty quick.
So could they hear you then?
Yeah, they could hear me, which I didn't know at the time, and so yeah, it was a little scary. But the other part, like I said, on the flight deck, planes are moving, and you just had to be really aware of your surroundings. Your head was moving all the time, your eyes were moving, and because you didn't want to be where you shouldn't be.
I can imagine that would be pretty disorienting, to say the least.
Yeah, at first it was, and you're on your own. I mean, the very first time, nobody's really showing you the ropes or anything. The first time I was out on the flight deck, I knew what to do, but there was no lead person there to take you, so you're pretty much on your own, and hopefully you make the right choices.
Did you ever just or does anyone else just stop and get sick, from all the motion going on?
No, I don't think you have time.
No.
No.
I know, sometimes you're sitting in a car and the car next to you backs up and all of a sudden you're moving.
Right, right. Well, you get a little, you feel the motion. Yeah, it's like I said, you're on feels like you're just on a platform moving around, with everything moving around you too. So, and plus since I work nights, most of our operations did, occur at night, but it made for some very interesting, happenings. So.
What about the weather?
Weather, that's another one. Weather's you never knew what you were headed to. We had beautiful days, and then we actually went through a typhoon. And that was interesting. So because the waves were breaking up to and above the flight deck, so you can imagine the flight deck's up 90 feet or whatever above sea level, and it's going down and breaking waves. So we had to chain down all the planes and grab as many chains as we could find and just change them. We put as many as we could in the hangar bay, but the rest of them we had to chain them down on the flight deck, and we lost one, but that was misfortune. But we could have lost a lot more.
So an entire plane went off the deck. Yeah,
they broke off the chains. They weren't tight enough, or I'm not really too sure what happened, but somehow it just it broke off the chains, and there it went. So.
Who lost rank over that one?
I don't know. Wasn't me.
Somebody.
Yeah, maybe not. I don't know.
So was it wasn't standard to keep them chained down all the time?
Yeah, it was. When we're not having ops, we chain them down, but we only put basic chains on them. But during severe weather and stuff, we get as many chains and we can find that will fit and put them on just in case, because one chain, there's a lot of stress on those. Even though there are big, heavy, bulky chains, but during that time we put as many as we could on them. So we had to get them out of the chain locker, which is right off the flight deck. You just jump down on the catapult there, or not the catapult, it was a little catwalk, and had a hatch there and just full of chains, and we just grab them and throw them up there, and somebody else grabs them and starts tying them down.
So you're, if I understand this correctly, you're running up and down this flight deck that's topsy-turvy with waves coming over the top.
Well, we didn't have operations going on then.
Oh, no.
No. Yeah, that's we couldn't. It was just impossible. So yeah, we were just trying to save it, get the planes and get out of the typhoon as best we could. And We were over by Vietnam somewhere. I couldn't tell you where, but we were in South China Sea, I imagine. Most of the time we didn't know where we were. So it was, we didn't get the full brunt of the typhoon, but we got, I can tell you they're pretty strong. I don't really want to do that one again.
I'd imagine not.
So,
what'd you guys eat?
we had pretty good food. We had regular mess hall and regular breakfast. Usually eggs. Sometimes scrambled. Sometimes you get them over easy for breakfast. Lunch meat for lunch, and then we'd get steak and lasagna, things like that. We had pretty good chefs on board ship. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't very good steak, but it was steak. So, but mostly hamburger and things like that. Just basic food. So.
Pretty impressed.
Yeah. Food was pretty good.
What did you do after you got out?
After I got out, I got offered a few jobs. Well, I didn't, I almost re-upped, and the reason, basically, the reason I wanted to re-up is because we had prop S2 aircraft, and they were going through the S3, which were jets, and they wanted me to re-up, and but they were going to send me to school. We lived in San Diego. I already had a house because we moved out of the apartment. I guess I bought it about a year before we got out of the service, and they wanted us to move to someplace on the East Coast. I'm thinking Virginia. I'm not sure. And go to school and go to training for the new S3s, and that's about the only thing that really turned me down. I didn't want to sell my house. I didn't want to go, so I didn't re-up. But we stayed in San Diego, and I had a few offers for in electronics, for job offers. But then eventually I just ended up going back to the Postal Service and started working as a carrier out there.
What do you think that the value of that house in San Diego would be today if you'd have kept it?
My house, I'll tell you what I bought it for. I bought it for $20,000, and that was in maybe 72 or something like that. And we made a pretty good profit selling it 5 years later. We went back 10 years later after that, and it was up over 100,000. So prices went way, way up. So. Yeah.
Sure. What was it like coming back during that era? Coming back from deployment and then also trying to transition.
It was since I already worked for the Postal Service, I knew I could go back to them. So that part I was not worried about too much, but I wanted to try something different in the electronics field. But all the jobs that were offered to me, I still would have had to move up closer to LA or someplace else, or drive 60 miles to work every day, and I didn't want to do that. But the transition, San Diego's a Navy town, so it wasn't really too bad because, a lot of people were still in the Navy. A lot of people got out of the Navy, as veterans and Marines. A lot of Marines down there too because we, Camp Pendleton and Miramar Naval Air Station, that was all right there too. So the transition part wasn't too bad. And because you had a lot of support from different people, and so I went back. I ended up going back to the post office for various reasons. My daughter was born about a year before I got out of the Navy too. So a wife, 2 children, a house. We're pretty well set, and I needed a job, so I went back and finished my career in the Postal Service after that.
Um, what was I guess the welcome home like? What were the civilians like around?
Depends on what part of town you went to, because there were activists, and mostly I ignored them. You know, you go to certain, you know, some of the beach communities. We lived inland, about 15 miles inland from actually downtown San Diego, and it was fine out there. But you go to some of the beach communities and things like, you know, different places, and there, you know, sometimes they had demonstrations here and there and things like that, you know, anti-Vietnam and all this other stuff. But actually, when I got out, the war ended, so it wasn't too bad. You know, there's that part.
When you went in and while you were deployed, what was your opinion of the conflict?
I didn't really have a big opinion of the conflict. I knew what was going on, but I didn't really know a whole history or background of it. You know, I was 19, and I really wasn't up on world events and things like that. I knew we were in a war, you know, that wasn't going well, and but I really didn't have a lot of opinions of it.
Is that how you feel today about it, or do you feel any differently?
No, about the same. I mean, it's, you know, you know, I understand it more. I know what was going on, and you know, you see a lot of the history, you know, the history stories and on TV and things like that. You know, going back through Johnson and, you know, and the conflicts and you know, how we were only supposed to send a few troops, and it just kept doubling and doubling, and more troops kept going over there, and then you know, we still weren't, you know, we weren't winning. We were, you know, so I think it's a war we didn't win. You know, so. Yeah.
Is there anything that you wish you would have done, not necessarily differently, or something you wish you would have seen, or you know, maybe now that you had served, whatever, you know, you've seen another occupation you would have enjoyed, maybe, or?
You mean in the service?
Yeah, in the service.
Well, I always wanted aviation. I always wanted to be a helicopter pilot, like I said earlier. So I did miss that. I wanted to train for it, but just the opportunity just wasn't there, and I couldn't do that. So, and even after I got out, you know, I still thought, you know, I wanted to do something more in aviation, but that didn't work out either. So.
You said you had a helicopter, or you had a pilot's license prior to joining. Do you still have a pilot's license?
Actually, I have a commercial pilot's license.
So do you still fly?
No, not anymore. No, I had to give it up. But yeah, no. After I got out, I used my VA benefits to get a commercial license, and all the other licenses, you know, you get on the way up to that. And so I was going to use it. I flew a little bit of charter flights, sightseeing flights, things like that down there. But actually, I was offered a job to fly the Alaska pipeline too, but I turned it down because we didn't want to move to Alaska. So, but that was, you know, after that, I just kind of pretty much gave up on it.
As being a veteran, has that helped your career since your service?
Yeah, I think so. Like I said before, you know, you learn respect, you learn, you know, leadership abilities and things like that, you know, in the military, which carries on in your civilian life, no matter what you think it does or doesn't, but it does. It just depends on how you utilize it. And, you know, at first, you know, I utilized a lot of that, different skills and, you know, respect for other people, and that kind of fall back and gave me a few promotions and things like that.
on the flip side, has it ever created a hindrance or any problems at all?
No,
No.
no, I enjoy it. I mean, I tell myself now I wish I did re-up and go to that school, in hindsight, but, I still miss the life, or think, not miss it immensely, but, but, I think about it more now, in the last 10, 15 years than I did before, and how much a lot of enjoyment, the people I met, the different things, the different experiences, the places I went. I do miss that.
Has that those experiences and those travels has that carried over to the rest of your life?
Yeah, it has. I always had an interest in travel, and I actually started a travel business and still do some consulting work and things like that, and help people plan vacations now. But we try to travel as much as we can, and ironically, it's our best trips are cruises. You'd think we wouldn't. I had enough water, but not really. And my wife enjoys it, so we do that. But I've seen all of the United States. I've been in all 50 states, and now we want to go out and adventure and see different places, and see what lifestyle's like. And what we've seen so far, we're glad we're U.S. citizens, so live in America. So that's helped out a lot.
What is on your travel list that you have not visited?
There's a lot. There's still places in the United States I haven't visited. I'd like to see more. When I was a child and during the Navy we lived in San Diego for 12 years, but West Coast is just I have in the mountains and have a passion for that. But I would like to see more parks and things. I would like to maybe go down to South America, and I would actually like to go back to Asia. I'd like to go back to Japan and China and go through that. Hong Kong was my favorite city. We stopped there, and even Singapore. Go back there, take my wife, and kind of show her some of the different places I went to while I was in the Navy, and the Asian lifestyle, and show her just how different everything is.
Did you go into Vietnam when you were in the service?
No, we never set foot on land. I didn't, but we had flights that went over there, but I never went over. I flew a little bit, but it wasn't that much.
Have you been there since?
No. No.
Is it on your list?
It's also on my list. Yeah. Well, one of our missions that I was going to talk about is we did recover one of the Apollo space flights, the capsule for that, and that was interesting. That was Apollo 16. I think it was Mattingly was the commander on that one. But we were out in the Pacific, and we were close by, and that was when it landed and splashed down in the Pacific. So we picked it out and brought the capsule and the crew, back to the Ticonderoga. Actually, the helicopter squadrons did all that work, but we were on board too, and that was kind of a proud moment because space travel still was another interest of mine, and doing that. So we brought the capsule back, came back to San Diego, and then about a day or two later, I brought my wife and my son down to the hangar where the capsule was, so they could actually see a space capsule. And the space capsules aren't that big, and there was 3 people inside that, so it was amazing to me, how cramped that was, but and how small it was. I thought it was much bigger, but it was pretty small. But I brought them down there, and we saw the capsule, and took a few pictures of that, and then left. And maybe about 6 hours later, exploded. So,
What?
yeah, they were offloading the fuel on it, and something went wrong, and I'm not really too sure. You know, all I know is they were offloading fuel, and there was something sparked an explosion, and the actual capsule and the defueling equipment, you know, blew up in the hangar and blew most of the hangar about. I think it injured about 40 people who were there. Nobody got seriously hurt, you know, but which was fortunate. But that was a little exciting too, because you know it's the timing of it. But you know.
Wow.
Yeah.
So let me back this up a little bit. Were you guys close enough when this capsule came down to? I mean, did you witness it or hear it? Or?
We could see the chutes. Yeah.
Good?
Yeah. We could. You know, right, maybe toward the last few seconds before it landed, we could see it. It was kind of a partly cloudy day, so we knew it was coming down, but you know, you just didn't know where. So everybody was up looking for it, and then at the last second, somebody spotted it, and we all looked over there and could see the chutes, and then excuse me, and then you know, the splashdown, and the helicopters went out and did their thing. Yeah, they had us pretty well spot on, you know, when they came down to picking it up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I'm surprised that there were no protective measures in place. This thing has the capability to explode.
Yeah, it was well, you know, I guess they, you know, offloaded fuel in quite a few of the other capsules too. You know, no problem, but just something went wrong with this piece of equipment, and it exploded too. So that went that one.
That is.
I think one of the, yeah, and you asked if I had any other thoughts. You know, some of the operations we did at sea, we left the Vietnam, and it was in the summer, so it was pretty hot, and went up to northern Japan, and then there's a major sub base for the Russians up off the Aleutian Islands. So we went up there and did some operations up there, and the Russian Badger jets flew over, you know, the carrier quite a few times, the big bombers, and those are enormous. And but it was kind of a friendly exchange. You know, they went by us, we were on the flight deck waving at them, and you know, they tipped their wings a couple of times, and so. But our operations didn't last that long. But I had to give part of my job was to give briefings when necessary to the pilots, you know, about, you know, maybe, you know, certain equipment or whatever. And the last one was we were up off the Aleutian Islands, and it was all fogged in, and we were still going to do flight ops. And you couldn't see from the middle of the ship to the either end. It was just so foggy. So we were looking for a window to get in. So I had to give a briefing to the pilots about what navigation or what equipment they could ditch in case they couldn't get back to the ship because of that. Yeah, to save fuel. And so I told them all that, and what wasn't necessary to navigation and stuff. Because besides the ship, the closest base we had, I believe it was about 500 miles away, something like that. There was a base in the Aleutians, and they could make a deadhead to there, but they would have to go there directly. After they took off, got altitude, ditched equipment, and kept their fingers crossed to make that island. And the only other option was Russia was right there. So we didn't, you know, that wasn't a very good option. But we got the flight we had an opportunity. There was a short window, and we got only about 5 aircraft off, and it closed in again. So then we were looking to get another window to bring the aircraft back, and we got that, but it was fogging back into, and I was on the flight deck because we're part of the recovery too. And when they're coming back in, and you can always see them come in on their glide slope, and but not that day. And so I'm listening.
What's a glide slope?
Glide slope is all aircraft as you're coming in for a landing. That's your glide slope to come in before you touch down. And so he was on glide slope and everything. And the next, he says, they're going like, okay, you know, abort, you know, because wherever he was, well, we found out where he was. It was down below the flight deck. He went too low, and at the last second, he kind of hopped up and jumped up there. At least it looked like he jumped up, but just kind of hopped up, caught the arresting cable, and you know, made it. And he was our last flight to come in, so that was a little exciting too. One of them did go on an earlier mission. One of them did go off the side of the ship. A friend of mine was on board that one, so they were being carried along off the side, and the pilot was trapped inside the plane, so he was trying to get him out, and eventually he did get out. So
that'd be pretty crazy.
Yeah, there's different things that happen. Some of them I forgot about, but I just happen to remember that one too. But yeah, just different things. Because there's no railing or anything on a flight deck. You just, you know, there's nothing to really keep you or anything else from, you know, going off, especially when you're moving things around.
Yeah. You brought your photo album.
Yeah, I
Want to tell us about it, and then if some of those other missions sparked your memory.
This is just something I put together. Fortunately, my kids, when they were young, like to use it to scribble in, but it was just different pictures of you know, being at sea, and showed the aircraft, and you know, so a few times you know, I'm working on deck and flight ops, but it also shows some of the ports we went to in Japan and Singapore. I got some pictures here of a refueling at sea, a resupply. We were at sea so long, we were running out of fuel, so they brought, you know, ship out, and we refueled, and we had to go through a refueling operation and run the lines from the ship next to us back and forth to give us, you know, jet fuel and fuel for, you know, for the aircraft carrier, and you know, some supplies too. So, you know, but
so you were not just for, you didn't work on just one airplane. You worked on multiple systems then for all the airplanes, right?
yeah, I was trained in all the S2s, so it didn't make any difference if it was my squadron or anybody else's squadron to do that. You can look through that, and you know, when they signal you, you go on board the aircraft. They open up. What you do, since we were working nights, and you find any little bit that you can. You know, when they signal you aboard the plane because they had trouble. Normally, you'd find the front gear, landing gear, and you'd work your way around it, and you follow down the belly of the plane until you got past the red line, because that's the prop line, and you go back past it about 3 feet, and then you can go up, and there's a side hatch door, and we went, you know, that's how you enter it. And so I go in there and talk to the pilot, figure out what it is, and you know, a lot of times it was radio equipment, sometimes you needed a new headset, sometimes it was just a circuit breaker, you know. But sometimes we did have to, you know, pull the radio and put a new one in too. You know, things like that, and then let them go. Or if they were down, they were down. You know, if they didn't have any communications.
This picture here, it almost looks like there's a parachute on top.
Yeah, that's actually a radar.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a reconnaissance. Actually we did lose one of those at sea.
Radar or airplane?
The whole plane. Yeah, they were coming in, lost an engine, and just couldn't maintain altitude, so they actually ditched. at sea, and I think there was maybe 2 casualties aboard. I think most of them got out.
They have to jump out, or they got ejection seats?
No, there's no ejection seats in those. Yeah. No, they didn't jump out. They just were too low. They just went down with the plane.
Oh.
Yeah, they did a sea landing. You can leave the gear up and do the best sea landing you can, and they didn't hit it just right.
Are you in this aircraft here taking this picture as it approaches? I think that's the flight tower of the aircraft carrier here.
Yeah, that's actually me taking the picture. I was actually riding this crew at that time.
What is that like, being in the airplanes, just trying to land on such a narrow deck? Like
It's yeah, it is a little strange. We flew from I flew a couple of times because a lot of times the electronics works fine, tests fine on the on the flight deck, but when they get in the air, it's just not working. So I go up with them and try to figure out what the heck's the problem. So I did fly a couple of times to that, but first time on the catapult, it really throws you back in your chair. I mean, you take off and you're up there and you look down and you see what you said, a postage stamp. And so we fly around, just work your way back down to the ship and stay on them. But they're really good. There's good instruments. They're a lot better now than it was then, but they watch you pretty good coming in. Like they watch your guide slope, and you have lights off the side of the ship that actually tell you if you're high or low, and you either have a green light or a red light. So you do that, and then once you catch that resting cable, first time I thought we missed it, and because you land on the angle, which is a short deck, and I thought we were going off the end of the deck, but all of a sudden it caught you and jerks you back. So that's exciting.
I would imagine the first time you do that, it's a pretty humbling experience.
Yeah, and the first time, well, like I said, when you take off, it throws you back, but when you stop, it throws you forward. Well, you got all your instrumentation right there in front of you, so you're kind of, make sure you're braced pretty good.
That's a pretty neat looking stadium here in Tokyo.
Yeah, Tokyo's, it was a neat city to go visit. It was.
What did you like about it particularly?
I don't think I have any pictures of it in there, but there's a lake somewhere around Tokyo. It's up in the mountains, and they take all their school children up there, and all the towns or villages around the lake are built like different cities. Like they'll have an American, not a city, but a town with American-looking houses, appliances, things like that, and then I'll have a Dutch, maybe a German, or and that's how they teach their school children, what it's like in different parts of the world. And that was, to me, it was very educational, and I enjoyed it. Tokyo itself is just a bustling city. With around the Tokyo Tower. Tokyo Tower is the main communications for all the radio and television for the whole area out there, and it is huge. It's bigger than the Eiffel Tower, but it's an amazing sight to see.
Yeah, I saw it. It's just 60 feet taller than the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah.
So it looks like, I think it's over 4. I mean, you went to quite a few countries.
Yeah, we went to Singapore. Was interesting. It was very clean, but they did have snake charmers out there. You go to a park and they had all their baskets, and they're playing their music, and snakes are coming out of baskets. So I'm not a big fan of snakes, so I kind of kept my distance on that one. But we went to Tokyo, Singapore, went over the Indian Ocean for a while. We did some ops over there because there was some Russian intervention over there going on, and so we had to make our presence over there too. What
was, as an American during this time of conflict, and what was your reception like as an American, and as they knew you were a service member in these other countries? What was, were you welcomed? Were you?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, we had civilian clothes, so we didn't wear our uniform while we were at shore. But they knew we were American. They knew we were servicemen, anyways. But most places, I mean, we took cabs, and most places were very receptive. I never really had a lot of problem. They actually knew more about our missions than a lot of times we did, like when we were leaving and where we were going. And I'm like, how do you know that? We don't even know that yet either. So it was that part was a little scary. So I having them know that. But during shopping and stuff like that, it's just like being an American tourist now over there. It wasn't really too bad. The only time we did have a problem was May 1st, which is May Day, and which is a big communist, anti-American. So we were actually in Japan at that time, and so they canceled all shore leave, and then we left the next day.
What was that like?
Well, we were on ship, so but we could see there was protesters around the gates and things like that.
And this picture here, it's some sort of picnic. Are you in the States in these pictures?
Might have been, that one was probably in Hawaii.
Okay.
Hawaii or Singapore. I know we had two times that the ship would put a picnic on for us while we were on shore leave. Okay. And gave us a little bit of time to relax.
Definitely no alcohol consumed that day, right?
No, there was. We had, I mean, not a lot. We had a few beers, but it was kind of funny. It wasn't just us. There was also a group of Australians. I was kind of with my squadron, and there was an Australian Navy sailors over, having their picnic too, and you always wondered, what everybody does for entertainment and things like that. And we were just around talking like that. And one of them comes over and he says, "Hey, mate," I can't speak Australian, so I'm terrible at that. But he comes over and he asks us if we want to fight. I go, well, we all kind of look and go, why? Did we do something wrong to offend you or something? And he goes, no, that's what we do. We just, in our free time, we just like to fight and, shake hands afterwards and go our own ways. And we go, nah, well, you might, I think they do over there, but but no, we really don't.
You send them over to the Marines?
Yeah. Yeah, see those guys over there? Yeah, SEAL team.
Tell me about this one here. And this is your caption. Gayest street near Shinjuku Station, Tokyo.
That's what it was on the card, and and what they meant by there was happiest or funnest, like a party type street, and that was their terms on it.
You have this. You have some pictures here, and then you have an article about U.S. Indian Ocean drill. What was this to you at that time?
Well, we didn't know what was really going on. I probably got the country's name wrong, but I believe it was Bangladesh at the time. And it's there was kind of an uprising there, and there was Americans there. So part of the mission we were told about was to go over there and rescue, the Americans that were on the island, or evacuate the Americans that were on the island, or that country, and get them out. But that never did come to that. It came, I guess, close, but we turned around. There was also a large Russian presence there too, and that's why I said earlier that we were over there just to kind of show force while we were over there. We did almost cause a large problem with the State Department because one of our helicopters, while we were over there, landed on an island because it was just a small island. There was a space to land. I guess one of the pilots or somebody wanted to pick up some souvenir seashells or whatever was down there, and they landed on this island, picked up a few shells. Some of the natives of the island saw them. Well, it wasn't, just a regular island. It was Chinese territory, so we landed an American plane on Chinese territory without permission, so we did have a little State Department involvement with that one. And so that pilot and they were transferred out to off the ship real quick.
So during this time period, I mean, this is during, we're paraphrasing this as the Vietnam era conflict, but this is also, in the backdrop of this is the Cold War. Right?
Yeah.
There's the whole, I made several Russia references. Was that weighing on your mind during this time frame? Or did you guys discuss it? Was it?
We were kind of out of the loop on a lot of things until after the fact. We knew we were headed to a place. The entire reason why we were going there was not really made clear to us, or just that we were going there. So the only news we got was what we got from home with letters, and like I said, it takes a couple weeks to get those. And that was about it, or whatever they told us over the intercom. We didn't have TV or radios or anything like that, or there was no cell phones or anything back in those days. But so they just said we're going over here, and that was it, and these are the ops. But so we were pretty much out of the loop.
And then earlier you mentioned that had that Russia was a possible place for that pilot to land. I wasn't
Yeah.
quite sure if that was sarcasm. Was that really an option at the time?
No, it was my option, but it wasn't their option. I did mention it too. The pilots I knew pretty good. Everybody, even though officer enlisted, but we all got along pretty good. But there was still that break and rank and they had their we respected their rank, and they had their own group, or stayed together. But as a pilot and then as a technician, I'm in there and I'm talking to them all the time. So they kind of respected me as my position too. So, but yeah, one of the pilots I did tell, I says, your other option would be like, go up about 6,000 or 10,000 feet or whatever it is, and parachute out, and hopefully everything's destroyed. But he goes, "Oh no, I can't do that." I'm like, "Yeah, I know, but." Just an option. Gary Powell, remember. So.
Well, do you have any other?
No, not really. No, I just, like I said, I was married and family life, and my wife was the biggest supporter. So. And I recognize that now, for all the military families, how much they really do, back home when you're not there. So.